The Amazon rainforest is a place full of life, colors, and secrets. Deep inside, where the trees touch the sky and rivers sing songs, there is a story that no one has heard before. It is a story of love, courage, and a little boy who changed everything. Listen carefully, because this story will touch your heart and stay with you forever. Once upon a time, in a small village near the great Amazon River, there was a boy named Tiago. Tiago was different from the other children. While others played in the fields, he spent hours listening to the whispers of the trees, the chatter of the monkeys, and the songs of the birds. His grandmother, an old wise woman, always told him, "The forest speaks, my child. Those who listen can hear its heart." Tiago loved the forest more than anything. But one day, something terrible happened. Strange men with loud machines came. They started cutting the trees, breaking the homes of animals, and poisoning the river. The forest cried, but no one listened. The villagers were afraid. They needed money, so they stayed silent. But Tiago couldn't stay silent. He ran deep into the jungle, tears in his eyes, looking for someone who could help. As he walked, the air became thick with sadness. The trees looked weak, and the animals hid in fear. Tiago sat near the great kapok tree, the oldest tree in the forest, and whispered, "Please help me. How can I save you?" A soft wind blew, and suddenly the forest answered. A small golden butterfly appeared and landed on his hand. Its wings shimmered like the sun. Tiago felt warmth in his heart. Then he heard a gentle voice, "Tiago, you have the heart of the forest. You are not alone." The voice belonged to Yara, the spirit of the river. She had watched over the Amazon for centuries, but she could not stop the destruction alone. "You must show your people what they do not see," she said. "But how?" Tiago asked, his voice shaking. "Take their eyes where they do not look. Take their ears where they do not listen. Show them the truth," Yara said before fading into the wind. Tiago knew what he had to do. He ran back to the village. He gathered the children first. "Come with me," he said. They trusted him, so they followed. He led them deep into the forest. He showed them the empty nests where birds once sang, the broken trees where monkeys once played, and the dry river where fish once swam. The children gasped. They had never seen the forest like this. "We must tell our parents," one child said. Together, they returned and spoke to the elders. "The forest is dying," they cried. The villagers hesitated. "What can we do?" they asked. Tiago remembered Yara's words. "We must take their eyes where they do not look. We must take their ears where they do not listen." So, he did something brave. He led the villagers to the heart of the jungle. He made them see what was hidden. He made them listen to the silence where there used to be music. And slowly, one by one, their hearts began to change. Tears rolled down the cheeks of the oldest man in the village. "I was blind," he whispered. "We have forgotten that the forest is our home too." That night, the villagers gathered. They decided to fight. They stood in front of the machines. They held hands. They sang the songs of their ancestors. And when the men with machines saw their strength, they hesitated. The forest was not empty. It was full of love. It was full of life. News spread. People from other villages joined. Soon, the world listened. The machines left. The trees stood tall again. The river flowed freely. And the golden butterfly danced in the air, whispering, "Thank you, Tiago." Years passed. Tiago grew old, but the Amazon remained young. People came from far away to hear his story. And every time he told it, he ended with these words, "The forest has a heart. It beats with ours. If we listen, we will always find our way home." Let this story stay in your heart. Let it remind you that even the smallest voice can save the biggest home. If you felt something today, if your heart listened, then share this story. Like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart, because the world is full of magic waiting to be heard. Tiago's story did not end there. Though the machines had left, the scars of destruction remained. The trees that had been cut would take years to grow again. The animals that had fled needed time to return. The river still carried the memory of poison. Tiago knew that saving the forest was not just about stopping destruction, it was about healing. One morning, as the golden sun kissed the leaves, Tiago stood before his people. "We saved the forest, but now we must give back to it," he said. "The trees sheltered us for centuries. The river fed us. Now it is our turn to care for them." The villagers nodded. One by one, they began planting new trees where the old ones had fallen. The children carried small saplings, their tiny hands full of hope. The elders whispered prayers to the earth as they placed the roots into the soil. Day by day, the green returned. The birds sang once more. The monkeys swung from the branches again. The river laughed as it danced through the jungle. But Tiago knew that not everyone in the world understood the beauty of the forest. There were still people out there who saw trees only as wood, rivers only as water, animals only as things to hunt. He needed to spread the message beyond his village. So, with a heart full of courage, Tiago set out on a journey. He walked for days through the jungle until he reached the great city. It was a place unlike anything he had ever seen, tall buildings made of stone, smoke rising into the sky, streets crowded with people who hurried past without looking at the trees around them. Tiago stood in the center of a busy square and called out, "Listen." I bring you a message from the forest. At first, no one stopped. The people were too busy with their lives. But then, a little girl with curious eyes tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mama, what is he saying? The mother listened. Then another person. And another. Soon, a small crowd gathered. So, with a heart full of courage, Tiago set out on a journey. He walked for days through the jungle until he reached the great city. It was a place unlike anything he had ever seen, tall buildings made of stone, smoke rising into the sky, streets crowded with people who hurried past without looking at the trees around them. Tiago stood in the center of a busy square and called out, "Listen! I bring you a message from the forest." At first, no one stopped. The people were too busy with their lives. But then, a little girl with curious eyes tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mama, what is he saying? The mother listened. Then another person. And another. Soon, a small crowd gathered. Tiago told them the story of the golden butterfly, of the trees that whisper, of the river that sings. He spoke of what had been lost and what could still be saved. His voice was small, but his words were big. They carried the weight of every leaf, every drop of water, every creature that called the Amazon home. A man in a suit scoffed, "What difference does one boy make?" Tiago smiled. "A single seed grows into a mighty tree," he said. "A single drop of water joins to make a river. A single voice, if it speaks the truth, can change the world." The people fell silent. In their hearts, something stirred, something they had forgotten. The memory of the wind in the trees. The laughter of rain. The warmth of the earth beneath their feet. And then, something incredible happened. The little girl reached into her pocket, pulled out a small paper, and began to draw. She drew trees, rivers, animals, and people holding hands. She held it up for all to see. "This is our world," she said. "We must take care of it." The crowd clapped. The story of the Amazon began to spread. People shared it with their families, their friends, their leaders. Soon, the world started to listen. Laws were made to protect the trees. Scientists came to learn about the plants and animals. Travelers visited, not to take, but to understand. And back in the village, the golden butterfly fluttered past Tiago's window. He smiled, knowing that the forest would live on, not just in the Amazon, but in the hearts of all who heard its story. The forest is not just a place. It is a feeling, a breath, a heartbeat. It lives in every tree that stands, every river that flows, every creature that roams free. And it lives in you. So, if this story touched your heart, if you felt even for a moment the magic of the forest, then let it grow. Share it. Tell others. Let the world remember that we are all part of the same great story. Like, subscribe, and join the journey. Because every voice matters. And together, we can keep the heart of the world beating strong. Years passed, but Tiago's story never faded. The village remained a sanctuary, not just for its people but for the countless animals and trees that called it home. The world had changed, slowly but surely. More people had begun to care. More hands had reached out to protect, rather than destroy. But Tiago knew that the battle for the forest would never truly end. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tiago sat by the great kapok tree. He was older now, his hair touched with silver, but his heart was still as young as the boy who had first spoken to the forest. A little girl ran up to him, her eyes wide with wonder. "Grandfather, tell me the story again," she begged. Tiago smiled. He had told the story 1,000 times, to villagers, travelers, even great leaders who came from distant lands. But every time, it was as if he was telling it for the first time. He lifted the girl onto his knee and pointed to the sky. "Do you see that butterfly?" he asked. The golden butterfly hovered in the air, its wings glowing in the fading sunlight. "Yes," the girl gasped. "That is a messenger of the forest," Tiago whispered. "It carries the story of our home." "And do you know why stories are so important?" The girl shook her head. Tiago touched her heart gently. "Because stories live forever. Long after we are gone, they keep whispering to those who listen." The girl's eyes shone. "Then I will tell the story too. I will tell everyone about the forest and the golden butterfly." Tiago laughed, his heart full. "Yes, little one. That is how we keep the forest alive. Not just with our hands, but with our voices." That night, as the village slept, the wind carried Tiago's story beyond the jungle, over rivers, across mountains, into the hearts of those who needed to hear it. Somewhere in a distant city, a young artist painted trees on the walls of buildings, reminding people of the beauty they had forgotten. A scientist discovered a new cure hidden in the leaves of the rainforest and fought to protect the plants that held the secrets of life. A teacher stood before a classroom of children and spoke of the Amazon, inspiring young minds to dream of a greener world. And far away, under the same sky, a child sat by a window, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees, feeling as though the forest was whispering to them too. This is how stories change the world. This is how we remember. This is how we heal. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that nature is worth protecting, then let the story live on. Like, subscribe, and share. Not just for me, but for the Amazon, for the golden butterfly, for the trees that still stand, and the ones yet to grow. Because the forest is calling. As the years passed, Tiago watched his village grow. The children who once followed him into the forest were now the protectors of the land. They had become wise elders, teachers, storytellers, and guardians of the Amazon. But even as the village flourished, Tiago knew that danger would always return, wearing different faces: greedy men, forgotten promises, silent indifference. One fateful morning, a young boy named Nilo ran into the village, breathless and afraid. "Grandfather Tiago, men have come again. They have machines, and they are cutting trees by the river." Tiago stood up slowly. His body was older now, but his spirit burned as bright as ever. He took Nilo's hand and walked toward the heart of the forest. As they approached the river, the sound of chainsaws echoed through the trees. The sight before them was heartbreaking: tall, ancient trees, falling one by one, their roots exposed like open wounds. The river, once clear, was turning brown with mud and waste. Birds circled overhead, crying in distress. The men cutting the trees saw Tiago and the villagers gathering, but they did not stop. "Go home, old man," one of them shouted. "This land is not yours." Tiago stepped forward, his voice steady. "This land belongs to no man. It belongs to the trees, to the rivers, to the children who will come after us. You do not own it, but you are destroying it." The men laughed. "We have permission. Papers from the city. This forest is nothing but wood for houses and money for our pockets." Nilo clenched his fists. "No! This forest is alive. It is our home." The villagers stood together, blocking the machines. They refused to move. Their ancestors had fought for this land, their children would grow here, and their spirits would one day rest beneath these trees. They would not let it be destroyed. Days passed. The workers grew restless. News of the villagers' resistance spread beyond the jungle. People from all over came to support them: environmentalists, journalists, even people from the city who once ignored the forest but had now begun to listen. And then, something incredible happened. One morning, as the sun rose over the Amazon, a group of children stood before the workers. They held hands and sang an old song, one that Tiago's grandmother had once sung to him. It was a song of the river, of the wind, of the endless sky. The men hesitated. One by one, they lowered their tools. One worker, an older man with tired eyes, stepped forward. He looked around at the trees, at the villagers, at the children. For the first time, he truly saw them. "I used to live in a village like this," he whispered. "I used to listen to the forest too." He turned to his fellow workers. "We were wrong." And just like that, the machines stopped. The men walked away, leaving the trees standing tall. The villagers cheered, but Tiago simply smiled. He knew the battle was not won in a single moment. It was won in hearts, in choices, in the stories that people carried with them. That night, as the village celebrated, Tiago sat by the river with Nilo. The boy looked up at him, eyes full of wonder. "Grandfather, how did you know they would stop?" Tiago chuckled softly. "Because, my child, every person has a forest inside them. Some have forgotten it. But when they hear the right story, when they see the right moment, the trees start to grow again." Nilo looked at the golden butterfly that had landed on Tiago's shoulder. "Then I will tell the story too. I will make sure no one forgets." Tiago nodded. "That is how the forest will live forever." And so, the story continued, carried by the wind, whispered by the trees, and held in the hearts of those who chose to listen. If this story touched you, let it grow. Like, subscribe, and share it, so the world never forgets that the forest is alive, and so are its stories. Because one voice, one heart, one story can change everything. And maybe, just maybe, the golden butterfly is waiting for you too. Will you listen?